Hi, this is Dr. Gwen Schlichter. Welcome to Week 4. In Week 4, we're going to focus on life in the coastal ocean. 7% of the area of the global ocean is coastal, but of that 7%, actually 44% or more of the global population actually resides along the coast. That's about 3.4 billion people. The coastal area of the ocean is a very important resource for fishing and other activities. But because so many people live along the coast, we have huge human impacts on the ocean along the coast. But because it's also relatively shallow and easy to get to, it's very well studied by scientists. This week, we're going to talk about a bunch of different habitats and focus on some of those human impacts. Here you can see Kelp Bed Habitats. This is the giant kelp here that we see along the Pacific Northwest coast. Kelp is actually a really interesting organism. It's not a plant. It is actually an algae, which is a different group of organisms. And you can see it has this holdfast here at the bottom. And then it has these blades that are like leaves and the stipe that is the long branching-like stem that they have. And it actually has a really interesting life cycle that's associated with it being a water-based organism and actually part of a group called protists. And it actually creates spores. It has sori, kind of like what you imagine on a fern. And it creates these spores, and these spores actually grow into gametophytes. Now, a gametophyte produces gametes. So this is a different type of organism than humans have. They have a gametophyte form that produces gametes, male and female. So we have the female producing an egg and the male producing a sperm. And these get fertilized, and then once they're fertilized, they're a zygote, and they grow into this organism that we know as what a kelp is, but we actually, in biological terms, call them sporophytes because they produce spores, which then produce the gametes, etc. So it's a very different life cycle than you're probably used to hearing about. But kelp beds are extremely productive. They create a lot of biomass, and because of that biomass, a lot of organisms feed on the kelp, and because of that, a lot of organisms actually feed on the organisms that feed on the kelp. So it's quite a very complex food web, and very, very important, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest. There's a very delicate balance between all these different organisms that are associated with kelp beds. And one of the big players in our community here in the Pacific Northwest is the sea otter. So these sea urchins will be feeding here on the kelp. And if they're not controlled, what can happen is these sea urchins can take over and decimate the kelp population, or the kelp plant or organism. It's not actually a plant, once again. And so what sea otters do is they feed on the sea urchins and keep the sea urchin numbers relatively low so that these sea urchins can feed on the kelp but actually don't completely destroy or decimate them. Another player in that is the sunflower sea star that actually plays a role in eating those sea urchins as well. So we need that balance, and it's a very delicate balance. Another community that we see along the coast is seagrass meadows. So seagrass meadows are going to be actually a plant. So unlike kelp, seagrass are actually plants. And a lot of things live in and around seagrass, and some organisms eat them. Not organisms here in the Pacific Northwest, but in tropic areas, things like sea turtles and manatees will feed on seagrass. So here's sort of the difference here in this picture. You can see that we have that hold fast in the stipe and the blade that you see with algae, which is a protist. And here we actually have a real plant. And seagrass is a really interesting plant because it actually comes from land and moved into the water. And so it actually has roots and rhizomes, and it has leaves, and it produces a flower, and those seeds will be floating on marine habitat. And so seagrass is a little bit different than our algae. This is the seagrass life cycle you can see here, much more complex. We still have this idea of a sporophyte and a gametophyte, but you can actually see that the gametophyte is really, really, really tiny and has been reduced to something smaller than a seed, essentially like pollen is the size of the gametophyte. The sporophyte would be the plant overall, and that produces that seed. So we have internal fertilization. It's quite a bit different. Here's another picture of that. You can see we have roots, we have blades, they have chloroplasts so that they can go through photosynthesis, and they're getting their nutrients directly from the water and their carbon dioxide directly from the water. Seagrass meadows are extremely important in supporting biodiversity, providing shelter for a lot of organisms. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we don't have organisms that feed directly on it, like we do in the tropics and like over in Florida where we have sea turtles and other organisms feeding on it. But they play an important role in adding oxygen to the water because they're a plant, right? And they actually help with climate resilience. So because they are close to the shore, they provide a lot of buffer between the land and the water. They provide habitat and food. Lots of organisms live in seagrass. And so those organisms then provide food for larger organisms. And the dead seagrass provides decaying matter for the organisms to feed on the smaller bacterial and microbial organisms. So this is actually an incredibly important resource, but because they're a plant, they actually grow quite slowly. And what happens is that people don't recognize it as an important resource, and what they do is they plow through it with boats and other things, especially recreational boats. And I know that you've seen it along the shore and people walk right over it, walk through it, or they rake it to get different kinds of clams and scallops and things like that that grow or hide in the seagrass, and that destroys that habitat. And once you've destroyed that habitat, it actually takes a really, really long time to come back. We have, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, eelgrass, and I know you've seen these along the coast, and we'll see this when we go out tide pooling, and they're an important resource in terms of the habitat. This is where we'll find moon snails, lots of different types of mollusks, nudibranchs and things like that live in this type of habitat, and lots of different small mollusks and other arthropods. So this is a really rich, diverse area habitat in the ocean, and we see this when we go out at low tide, and we have to be very careful to be as careful when we tread so that we have as little impact as possible. Another type of community we see along the coastal range of the ocean is these soft bottom communities, and of course this is that soft sand area that you walk through that's not rocky, and a lot of different organisms live in those type of habitats too. Here is a picture of sand dollars, which is a very, very common organism that we see in sandy habitats. And most of the time we see them dried when they're dead, and we collect them because they're so beautiful to look at. But this is an important organism that lives in that area. Here are some other types of soft bottom community plants, lots of organisms, We can see crabs and sea squirts. They don't have it here, but sea cucumbers will often live in that kind of habitat. Lots of worms, tube worms and things like that. Lots of fish feeding on the smaller organisms, and of course things like clams and clamworms. Here's a picture of some of the organisms that we commonly see. You can see we have things like brittle stars, we have sea anemones, different kinds of crabs, sea pens, and other types of skates and things like that, which we don't have so much of, but there's a lot of in the tropics. Another topic that is discussed in this chapter that talks about coastal communities and coastal habitat is a coastal dead zone. So dead zones are a really important thing to discuss, and this dead zones happen when essentially the water becomes deprived of that oxygen that needs to be available for organisms to live. And there's actually quite a lot of dead zones. These are poorly oxygenated areas, like I mentioned. The classic one is on the Gulf Coast. That's the one that we focus a lot on. There are some down here in Southern California, up on the East Coast, but the big areas of dead zones are right here on our side of the ocean, right in the Pacific Ocean and a little bit of the Atlantic. There are dead zones all over the world. And this is generally created by algal blooms triggered by nutrients. So when overabundance of nutrients ends up in the water, these algal blooms happen and they create dead zones, which means these are areas that are very, very low in oxygen and very few marine creatures and plants can survive in that kind of habitat, and it creates this area which is depleted of any kind of biodiversity, and it's very, very difficult for that area to come back and to be reestablished. And so these are important areas to look at, and this is just showing you some of the example of when you have that plankton And in a healthy community, you have these interactions with oxygen's coming in and it's feeding these different organisms. It allows for photosynthesis to happen. But when you have these big algal blooms, because a lot of nutrients like fertilizer, etc., ends up in the water, the algae basically suffocate everything out. They block the light. Because they're blocking the light, they're also dying in massive numbers, and that all that dead organic matter ends up at the bottom of the ocean, and when that dead organic matter and dead organisms do, it creates even more of a depletion of oxygen. As I mentioned, the Gulf of Mexico being one of the greatest areas of the dead zone, so the amount of oxygen is extremely low in that area, less than 2%. And this is something that was this is the numbers based on at least a couple of years ago now, but you can see it's about 8,776 square miles, so about the size of New Jersey. So big area, big concern. And sort of related to this is this harmful algal blooms. Now we know that these harmful algal blooms are called HABs, H-A-B. They are associated with the dead zone, right? That's part of it. But these harmful algal blooms that they're talking about in the book are also specifically ones that are toxic, generally caused by an organism called a dinoflagellate. We've talked about dinoflagellates before in terms of their relationship with coral. Dinoflagellates live in the tissues of coral and provide sugars through photosynthesis for the coral to help them survive. And so they're extremely important in the survival of coral. There's also dinoflagellates that are free floating and want also to go through photosynthesis and produce oxygen as well as other sugars for as a resource for the ocean and for other organisms. But there are some dinoflagellates that go through a secondary metabolic process where they produce these toxins, and some of these toxins are then consumed by fish. They consume the dinoflagellate and then they become toxic themselves, and that's when it becomes really dangerous for humans. There are different factors that influence the growth of those harmful algal blooms. They flourish under high light conditions and when any kind of elevated nutrient is present, particularly in urban environments, agricultural runoff, leakage from septic systems, and wastewater can allow for these organisms to flourish and then cause these harmful algal blooms. So this is just illustrating those agricultural runoff. Lots of seashore bird droppings can cause that. Drinking water and all sorts of different types of septic input into the ocean can also cause these harmful algal blooms. The last thing I wanted to mention is biological invasions. And biological invasions are dangerous because they introduce new organisms to an area of the ocean that they're not normally living in. And like any other kind of biological invasion, this means that often native species cannot compete because these organisms have nothing to control them, have no predators or anything that will control them. And this happens often through ballast water. If you haven't heard of ballast water before, it's when these large cargo ships, when they are empty, what they do is they fill their tanks with ballast water, and that's going to be at the source port. And then they will transport that water. They have the cargo hold empty. They'll transport that water. And then when they go to the new port, what happens is they dump that water when they're taking on their new full load. And this helps them keep balanced in the water. But what it means is that they're taking water from one area and dumping it in another area. And what that means is they're also taking those organisms from one area and dumping them into another area, which becomes a problem. About 7,000 species are transferred in ballast water every hour of every day. So that means one new invasion every 9 weeks. And so this means that this is an immense problem because it allows for this possibility of major invasions into new areas of the ocean where these organisms would never normally exist. Here are some examples of some of the organisms that have been introduced to other areas. Zebra mussels is the classic. It's a pretty well-known and problematic organism. It competes with other mussels and other types of mollusks that we eat or that are farmed and cause big problems with that. The mitten crab is another one of those, and a lot of different plant species. hydrilla being one of them, milfoil is another. There's quite a lot of them. And in the tropics, one of the big detrimental organisms that's been introduced, although it's very pretty to look at, lionfish is a extremely detrimental biological invader in the tropics. And we'll talk about lionfish when we go to the fish museum. There's a lot that's associated with lionfish that we'll discuss, and you'll see what these organisms look like. And this just goes through that process where we have the species in its natural habitat. The species is then transported to a new habitat, and when it's introduced to this new territory, if it can survive and reproduce because it has no natural enemies and it can deal with the new conditions, then new populations are established of this invasive species, and then they are dispersed and spread. And so this is where it becomes a problem. Plastic debris is also discussed when we talk about coastal areas. So this is showing some areas in Asia that beaches are covered with this kind of trash, and you can see many of them are things you probably use in your own household. And organisms come into contact with plastics, and many organisms are hurt by the different kinds of plastics. They end up in their stomach. They're often mistaken for food items, and I know that sounds odd, but floating bags can look a lot like jellyfish. A lot of organisms eat jellyfish, but also little pieces of plastic can be mistaken for food as well. It creates these big, large, vast areas of trash. One of the great ones is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. 46% of the total mass is made out of discarded fishing gear, but also other plastics, including microplastics. This is the fact that we really do live in a world where everything is covered and coated in plastic, and we don't really think a whole lot about where that ends up, and a large amount of it ends up in the ocean. This is what it looks like. So just imagine a big trash heap in the middle of the ocean. There's not just one, there's many of them. Here's the Western Garbage Patch, there's an Eastern Garbage Patch. It's really quite sad to think of how many garbage patches we actually have in the ocean. And this one's off the coast of Florida. Off the coast of California. And this is showing you another example of that. You can see the Pacific trash vortex is about the size of Texas. And remember, these all have to do with gyres that are associated with the global conveyor belt. Another issue that we've seen associated with our own impact here on the ocean is sea star wasting syndrome. This has been something that has been talked about for some time. First really discovered in the early parts of the 2000s, and something people have been studying for quite some time. You can see that the populations of sea stars are on the decline. Here's just showing the California coast and where we have severe problems with this viral infection. Now, it's primarily a viral infection, but there are other things associated with it because this virus has been around for a long time, and only now in the last 20 years has it been having this huge impact. So this was a sea star count almost 10 years ago. But definitely this has been having an impact on sea stars, making them sick and essentially making them fall apart. They get lesions, and then they start to lose their arms. The last thing I wanted to mention, which isn't mentioned in the book, but something important to consider, is the effect of salmon farming, which we do here in the Pacific Northwest in the Salish Sea off the coast of most of Washington. And this also has extreme environmental impacts. So open ocean aquaculture, what happens is that we put a lot of impact by salmon farming, because when this happens, there's a lot of food that's thrown into the ocean to feed these organisms. They don't eat everything, so there's a lot of fish waste associated with it, both with the food and as what the fish are pooping back out. They use drugs and chemicals and antibiotics to help these fish survive, so that's also going into the ocean. Any disease and parasites that exist in these populations are going to be proliferated in the ocean. And also escaped fish will go out, and then they will compete for food, transmit diseases. They'll also potentially reduce the health of the wild populations by breeding with them. And then, of course, this brings other kinds of predators and things that are going to be impacted both by the organisms as well as the chemicals, etc. So it's another thing to consider about coastal habitats. It's very much more specific here to the Pacific Northwest. In the next few weeks, we'll be tide pooling. You've probably already gone on some self-guided tide pooling adventures already, but we will be spending some of our field trips going out to tide pools to look at these different organisms and talk about these impacts and these interactions, and talking about adaptations to different places in the tide zone. So tide pools are a great way to see a lot of these different types of habitats I've mentioned, but also observe some of those impacts that we also discussed and consider what it's going to do to these different habitats, but also maybe take some action and be involved in things like beach cleanups, etc. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next part of the quarter. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great week.